Thank you so much, Chuck. It is so special to share this virtual space with such a dear friend. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. Hello, bonjour, and sat sri akal. My name is Jasveen Brar. I'm the co-executive director at Youth Climate Lab, a youth for youth incubator dedicated to supporting and creative innovative climate action. Thank you everyone for joining us today at our panel, Driving Shifts for Climate Action in Canada. We are joined today by three incredible leaders who I will allow to introduce themselves. Chris, on to you first.
Thanks, Jazz. I'm Chris Henderson. I'm the Executive Director of Indigenous Clean Energy, which is a national partnership hub for Indigenous participation in clean energy across Canada. I'm delighted to be with you here today, and I'm also honored to be involved with the University of Waterloo, on which I serve as faculty with several of the organizations there. Thank you.
Perfect. On to Elaine Next.
Bonjour à tous. Merci, Jazz.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Jasveen.
I'm leading an organization based in Montreal that tries to advance both science and adaptation to climate change. To reduce the risk generated by the portion of climate change that is unfortunately somewhat unavoidable. So I'm happy to be with you this morning.
Thank you so much. And lastly, to our final panelists, Jana.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jana Bandy, and I'm an executive director in the Climate Change Branch, which is located in the Department of Environment and Climate Change Canada. And I support colleagues all throughout the federal government in collaborating and coordinating our whole of government federal climate action.
Thank you so much for your introductions. I'm so excited to share the space with you today and to just be here with all such incredible leaders in this space. We'll dive into our first question, which is, climate disasters in Canada have piled up in 2021, from record heat waves to devastating floods and fires and droughts that are said to be the worst in Canadian history. These are just some of the symptoms of the broader crisis of a changing climate. As we sit here today in early 2022, what do you see as the critical shifts needed for Canada to make meaningful action on climate change?
So I think you're going to come to me first, Jazz, so let me dive in. In order to combat climate change, we have to look at a clean energy transition. It's the only way to really get there to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm honored that Indigenous communities across the country and the many colleagues that I have, both in Indigenous clean energy and over 1,600 people around the country, have been working on that for a couple of decades and onwards into the future. Indigenous communities are today the largest and most powerful clean energy community in Canada, apart from Canadian utilities. They own or co-own or have a defined financial benefit agreement with over 20% of Canada's electricity generating infrastructure, almost all renewable. And what we have seen is that that story, that past and into the future, is carving a new way of designing how we do clean energy to really realize a suite of benefits that address climate change as one of the SDGs, but also a number of the other SDGs in health, economic development, gender, and so on. And so, along with my colleague, Freddie Huppe-Campbell, we've been doing a lot of work on this, and we'll shortly share a publication in May that speaks, in fact, how you can take action on clean energy, but also do it congruently with taking action on climate. And in fact, that creates a virtuous circle that's more impactful. We think there are three forces that have driven this. One is the fact that local community involvement is crucial. We have to decolonize power. We have to democratize energy. And if you have local communities, Indigenous communities, and others involved in that process, you create a force of change that grounds clean energy futures that address climate in fact, results that also give you SDG benefits. Secondly, is that you have to look at the traditional stewards of the land, Indigenous communities. And traditional knowledge has informed of how you can do things with clean energy that are congruent with SDG goals like life underwater and life on land. And thirdly, there's new forms of partnerships that we have to strike between Indigenous communities, local communities, utilities, governments, provincial and territorial and federal. And so that's what we think is the critical approach. We can deal with the crisis of climate, but we can also deal with the opportunity of clean energy. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. I'll open up the stage to our other panelists if anyone would like to add anything else.
Yeah, I definitely like what Chris has said, and it illustrates the fact that one of the shifts that we have to make is to realize that we have many small shifts to make at the same time. There's a lot of things to do, and this means that we probably need to move away from incremental changes and think really about transformational changes, and to really rethink what we were doing before and to rethink it in a major, systematic way. And each of us has a role to play in there. So for example, I'll give an example with my organization. So Uranus is trying to advance adaptation to climate change. So it's only one portion of the issue. And in order to do so, we are doing it by working less internally with our own internal capacity, but also creating ongoing connections with various types of stakeholders, researchers, young people, etc., in order to even a bit revolutionize the way that we do science, to be able to cope with the future issues, reduction of greenhouse gases, adaptation to climate change. So in my organization, what I try to say my people to do is to connect with others, develop project, co-develop project. Don't just come up with ideas of project without consulting people. You may exchange ideas, etc., but at the end of the day, you absolutely need to collaborate and to dialogue. And even, we have to be realistic about this. The word collaboration sometimes is an issue because we're going to have different ideas about how we should move forward. So I also try to add the word cohabitation, recognizing that we will not always agree and that we need to cohabitate in order to advance for a better future.
Great points. Yeah, so important to focus on collaboration, co-adaptation, as you just said, and also to focus on our stewards of our lands. I'll actually kind of rephrase my next question. Elaine, you did answer part of it, but for our other panelists, if anyone would like to comment, how do we create the conditions for collaboration across Canada? What societies are part of it? How do we support this acceleration? And lastly, do youth play a role in this movement as well?
I think your point about youth is critical. With Indigenous clean energy in the last couple of years, we've introduced several major programs that deal with Indigenous youth participation on clean energy. Our Generation Power program, which is placing Indigenous youth after college and university into organizations, private, public, and institutional, to start them on their careers in clean energy. And we also have a program called Imagination, which is supporting Indigenous youth to actually take action on projects in their own communities. But I think in terms of the barriers to overcome and how you do collaboration, Jazz, I think we have to realize is that, the future has to be different than the past. If we're decolonizing power, the nature of relationships have to be different. And that involves the way we develop energy that addresses climate change and how we get to a net zero future. In that regard, what we feel is critical is that we move to more of a civil society approach, a more inclusive approach to the planning of the electricity future. It doesn't have to be your utility putting out a report to say, here's our plan for the next 5 or 10 years. It needs to be an expression of society. And to us, the planning of that is critical so that you have a more engaged approach. I'm 100% convinced that when people and communities are involved with climate action actually occurs. The second thing I think we have to change is recognizing that a lot of change in terms of addressing a clean energy future that is the climate friendly lies with provinces and territories. We need to embrace and recognize that every province and jurisdiction will have different approaches, but we have to engage with those realities and take action on them. I'll give one example before turning to others. When you look at the SDGs, one of them is about good health. Well, certain kinds of clean energy can have a very major impact on good health. If you in fact have energy efficient housing, where the air quality in housing is cleaner, you have less chronic illnesses like respiratory illnesses. Well, that not only is a great human benefit, which may not be a metric that can be recognized by the SDGs, but what can be recognized is the incidence of illness, chronic illnesses. But those also represent one of the biggest expenditures for provincial and territorial governments. So I think what we have to realize is that as we take action on climate, we have to have an integrated approach that is looking at a new design of how we take action on clean energy so that we are intentionally realizing the real and full value of clean energy in areas such as better health.
Absolutely. Amazing points, Chris. In this field, we see so many intersectionalities and each sector influences the other, and having this collective approach is so necessary. Before moving on to our next question that we have for today, Genevieve, I just wanted to open up the stage to you as well, if you wanted to comment on anything.
Sure. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of the comments from Anna and Chris and some, I think, really important concepts. The first is the transformational nature of what's happening right now. And I think tremendous credit goes to the scientific community, civil society, including Indigenous leadership, to have reset our mindset in that, I think, at all of the government levels and at a society-wide level. And so from the federal government view, the idea that this transformation needs to happen, clean energy, absolutely foundational, but really in every sector, as we look across at buildings, agriculture, heavy industry, transportation, there's really tremendous opportunity to transform. But to Chris's comment about how integrated that transformation needs to be, the importance of kind of considering how, as we do this transformation, that we are inclusive in our approach and that we understand that what is good for adapting to the current impacts of climate change is also good to mitigate the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions. But once you start thinking at that level and working at that level, it's all encompassing. And there aren't any SDG goals that actually aren't touched as you try to collaborate on this, social, economic, and environmental transformation. From the federal government level, I know that collaboration can seem difficult sometimes because the federal government is this kind of vague and large entity, and what does it do and how does it operate, especially for youth and other, citizens who don't necessarily kind of tap into how government process works. But I'd like to offer that I think, over the last few years, there's been an increased understanding of exactly what Chris spoke to, the critical importance of having ideas from all sectors of society, because we clearly need to generate solutions that we can't come up with single-handedly because of the depth of the transformation that's required. And there are a number of opportunities, from online consultations to allying with civil society organizations, informal partnerships, taking advantages of programs. But there are tremendous opportunities for youth to get engaged either individually or collectively.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So far, each of our panelists, we've touched upon the themes of climate adaptation, collaboration, as well as risk mitigation. So I would like to ask, how does climate adaptation and risk mitigation figure into the shifts that Canada needs to make? And building upon that, what does that look like for different segments of our society? For example, residents, private sectors, governments, et cetera.
Jazz, there are certain points of intersection that are quite interesting between mitigation and climate adaptation. I particularly point to the boreal biosphere, which is a large part of our country and essential for preserving climate in the way we need to preserve it. But it's also a great source of biomass that can be used for different things that's used by the forest product sector. But we can do a much better job of protecting the biosphere, protecting species, and in fact, looking at sequestering carbon more effectively, but also extracting that carbon and converting it into clean energy, where something that Indigenous communities want to do more and more, like the Meadow Creek Tribal Council in northern Saskatchewan, which they're doing it on that side. So I actually think one of the greatest areas of opportunity for integrated climate action that deals with both mitigation and adaptation is looking at the nature of our forests. I think we have to look at our forests as not only as an ecological basis that also is essential for the traditional foods and medicines of Indigenous communities, but we can also look at it as a resource that can be sustainable as for fuels and feedstocks that help us move away from carbon fuels. So that's one area of opportunity we're excited about. And I love the point, Janabi, that you mentioned about mindset. In the book that Freddie Hoope Campbell and I have been coming out, one of the things we see, this is about mindset, mindfulness, and mind shift. And so we actually have to do all three. A mindset is saying we got to think differently. Mindfulness is saying, I believe differently. I and the collaborators I have want to be differently. And mind shift is actually to take that action forward. And so one area where I think is particularly fertile is looking at how the biosphere of the boreal can be managed differently, better to sequester carbon, protect ecologies and species, and protect nature, but also become a resource that's more sustainable in terms of our transition to a net zero future.
If I may jump in here, because I think there's a key element that has just been pointed out now. One of the shifts that we need to make, and it's starting to happen, but that has not happened yet, is that there's a lot of economic players that think that the solutions around climate change are technological in nature. Technology is obviously going to help us, that's for sure. But it's really the mindsets, the changes in the behavior that are going to make the huge difference. And I think if there's one major shift that we should make as quickly as possible, it's especially this one. And unfortunately, the attractiveness of technology make it so that we don't want to ask ourselves too much the question about the need to change our behaviors, our consuming patterns, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's really one of the major shifts that is actually common both to reduction of greenhouse gases, to adaptation to climate change, and to many other environmental issues.
Just adding to those comments, absolutely, I think we're at this critical moment really for being able to change, to be able to now take this new mindset and transform it into action. And as the government has started working on a national adaptation strategy, one of the things that's come out is the need for local communities, municipalities particularly, to have the tools and resources to be able to now, deploy these ideas of adaptation and resilience. And it's really important for the government and other kind of entities to at scale be able to develop those type of accessible and available toolkits and resources so you can now take that action. And I think that's true for individual citizens as well, right? It's not only can you not advance action, it can be debilitating to have shifted your mindset but not be equipped with the tools to be able to transform. I think moving from local communities and individuals to larger enterprises and the economic systems, for instance, like finance, that drive economic change. In that regard, I think it's really important, the work that's being done now to change the way we understand investment choices through price signals, like putting a price on carbon, as well as regulations and other actual requirements to shift from mindset into action, so you can make those choices in a new set of parameters that are going to actually contribute to mitigation and adaptation.
If I may add, one of the challenges that we have is that we need to do all of those shifts, but people and organizations are at varying stages of even recognizing there is an issue to already implementing stuff and being so far ahead. So I think then it becomes key again to talk about collaboration, to talk about patience. We need to be patient, not with respect to time, but with people and organization, in order to recognize that everyone is advancing at different speeds and that we need to be inclusive as much as possible to advance in a more systematic way in the future.
Thank you so much, panelists. Elaine, your comment about inclusivity builds directly into our next question, which is, with so much change on the horizon, the shifts that we're seeing in our climate landscape, especially this week, just days after our IPCC report having been released, do you see climate action as an opportunity to fundamentally change our economy to become more resilient, more inclusive, and more sustainable? And building upon that, who do you see as being left behind? Who's not in the room? And how might they be a bigger part of what this new economy can be?
That's a really, really good question, Naz. What I think is that climate action certainly motivates a section of the population who are committed to it to participate. But you're right, maybe a large chunk, or maybe the majority, in fact, even maybe 70, 80%, not sure where it is, even though they support action on climate change. So where are they in that? I think that this is where the SDGs are particularly utilitarian. I think if you can talk to people about how it helps engage gender, how does it protect the environment, how does it promote good health, how does it contribute to economic development? Climate action is not about climate action, it's what does it get you? And yes, it is preservation of the species and preservation of the planet in a sense. But really what needs to talk about, the SDGs can talk about saying, if we want to have local economic development, if we want to have gender involvement and inclusivity in the development of a clean energy economy, that's what we're working towards. So action on climate is a means to an end. And I think we engage more people, and therefore people are more inclusive when there's a means to an end. People can buy into that. If you protect a habitat or an ecology, all the people in that habitat and ecology benefit. In effect, what we have to do is make externalities internalities. Internalities both for clean energy projects and internalities for society, such that we have more motivation for policy change, for fiscal investment in the change that we want to encourage. And so that's how I think you get the maybe nobody left behind as we take climate action. If we look at climate action being, what does climate action get you? And I think that motivates more people to be on side, to be part of that parade, not just in the parade, but even at the head of the line. And I think we're trying to see a new future. And the 3 C's I'd emphasize is community, culture, and conservation in that. If people see my community benefits, and people don't want to develop as an individual, they want to benefit as a community. For Indigenous communities, if they say, this is an expression of my culture, the 2nd C. And thirdly, if people say, this is moving to a conservative future, a restorative future, not just a protective future of the environment, people say, that's where we want to be. And so I really think it's about what the SDGs offer in terms of what climate change action gets you, which will really turn the switch to have the vast majority of Canadians involved in saying, I want to be there, I want to support that, I want to play a role in that.
If I may, I fully agree with those points, but at the same time, there are challenges in doing that. And I was actually doing lots of media interview over the last 2 days with respect to the IPCC report. And then you have the media, and I think there's need to be a shift in the media on how they communicate the information. You know, the media was always interested with the doom and gloom with respect to the reports of climate change. At the same time, if you go through the IPCC report, it's pretty impressive, the links that they make with each of the SDG objectives. And you see the shift happening in the scientific community to switch from documenting the problems to finding and contributing to the solutions. And I think that this latest IPCC report, there's been a much stronger effort to make everyone realize that the science can provide a lot of tools in order to find solution, and the science is not only there to discover the problems and the issues that we have.
Elaine, I could respond to that point because I think it's a fair one that, you know, we do need the media to be different, but I also think there's a point where we all have to be different in our own communications. I think social media offers us, especially of young people, a way to communicate very differently, and that's one of the powers of change. In our work with Indigenous community, we place a lot of priority on very active social communications and telling the stories, the storytelling of how Indigenous leadership of clean energy that takes action on climate, in fact, has a result which is beneficial for those communities and in fact for Canada. So I think it's important for us to get in storytelling and engage. I think, you know, I don't know about you, but I love reading really good stories. I love hearing good stories. It touches me in a different place. It gives me the motivation. It gives me the strength to say, yes, I'm going to work harder and differently and take the effort to make change. So I encourage everybody in this forum, and in fact, particularly young people, to be incredibly active in your networks and your socials to really share stories of powerful change. I think that will really add to the conventional media in terms of engagement of community.
Very true, Chris. There's such a power in storytelling, and I think that's really at the core of this movement, being able to speak to people's hearts, having them see themselves in this work, in the steps towards a more sustainable future. So I just wanted to comment and say that I really love that.
I wanted to just jump in to respond to Chris's articulation about the different perspectives. And I just find that very powerful in this moment. I'm coming to you from Ottawa, and we've had some very kind of social fracturing type events happen here. And they are, indicative of real fractures in our society. And they're also indicative of the challenges we have in speaking to each other and having a real kind of democratic dialogue and an ability to dissent and engage. And, going back to your question about, is climate action an opportunity for significant social transformation? My answer would be, it requires significant transformation. Like, there isn't actually a way to solve this problem without changing everything. But I think there are a lot of drivers that have come up, in recent times, a lot of conversations, from reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada to Black Lives Matter movements. These are all actually connected in us having to renew and refresh that social contract in Canada. And the idea that we will all come to it for different reasons, and it doesn't necessarily require alignment of, that we use the same language or we have same beliefs, but there is something in this transformation from everyone, and there has to be a place in that transformation for everyone for it to make sense.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, panelists. We're actually approaching into our last question of the day here, and then I also wanted to open it up to the audience as well. If any folks have questions, please submit them, and if we have some time, we'll open it up to the audience and any questions as well. So bringing it back to the Sustainable Development Goals, and the overarching theme of why we're gathered here today, the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals are this holistic framework on sustainability and change needed in the world across economic, social, and environmental domains. Do you think that the SDGs play a big role towards Canada's action on climate change? And do they create an opportunity that might not have been there before?
Jazz, I think they can, but we've got more work to do to really amplify that. And I hope that the book that Freddie and I are writing will contribute to that as people see it in May and June. What I think, again, we've got to be careful with the SDGs to not be captured by the technicalities of the SDGs and the framework of it. To me, it's a way to look at how we do really good things for the society and economies that affect the environment, including climate change and greenhouse gas reduction. So I think that what we try to do is to say, look, the SDGs are a way to look at how we design and our societies and design clean energy projects with Indigenous participation and local participation, so that it gives you the end results. I think focusing on what the SDGs are rather than the SDGs themselves is really important. So if you look at SDGs, they're looking at good health. Well, who's going to have an issue with that? No one. In fact, to Janabi's point, that's why, in fact, society can embrace that together. So if you say, look, by focusing on this, we want to get good health, the SDG structure allows us to make sure we're taking action on clean energy projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, so we're maximizing the benefits on good health. And that creates externalities of internalities. And in fact, what you're doing is creating a virtuous circle. And so I think the SDGs are a very important mechanism, but we have to be careful how to use it so people don't say, oh, it's about the UN, or it's another structure like ESG, it's another structure like corporate sustainability. No, it's what it is an embrace of society. And it's getting to what society wants to have and realize. I mean, we all want to protect the environment, and we want to have good health, and we want to have economic development. The question is using the SDGs as a tool to get there in the domains that we do it. I mean, we say that clean energy is one of the biggest pathways for reconciliation, but we can have even a greater impact by making sure that the SDGs help us design and realize the full societal value and the full economic value from clean energy.
If I may add to that, I fully agree with those comments. I mean, we regularly work with people working, underground with a municipal land use planner or an engineer for Hydro-Quebec, or people all over, that are interested about the impacts of climate change and are a bit worried. And they never talk about the SDGs. They probably don't even know what are the SDGs. And it's fine, because in the sense that they have so many urgent matters to deal with that they don't really have time. But I think that if we also have a systematic approach, I mean, that's the way that we are trying to work with our organization, to reconnect users with the science, to develop projects that answer very specific needs, and then to train students, to train people that develop their masters or PhD, etc., that are then hired by those same organizations. On the medium and then on the longer term, we make progress. We gradually connect the SDGs much more theoretically, even speaking, with underground organization that have to deal with all kinds of requests from various people, etc. So I think we need to use different words. I fully agree with the storytelling portion. I think it's part of it, to make the connection with the storytelling, with the SDGs, etc. And if you, again, read at the IPCC report that was published a few days ago, there's lots of hope to actually use them further to make the connections between what's happening on the ground on a daily basis with the weather and extreme weather event, all the way up to SDGs.
Anything to add here, Jana B, if you would like to? We actually have a comment from the audience as well, which ties into the Sustainable Development Goals, which is, how can we my apologies. I guess, how do we make conversations around the Sustainable Development Goals more accessible? So I think thinking in the framework of, your day-to-day folks that you meet that may not have heard about Sustainable Development Goals before, how do we create an environment that is inclusive for them?
Yes, we got to make it real. You have to touch it. Next week, the Heiltsuk First Nation on the coast of BC and the community of Bella Bella is having a celebration day about their actions on clean energy. They started that journey about 2-3 years ago, and there's a couple of lovely YouTube videos that talk about how they've replaced, or are about to replace, almost all of their homes' oil furnaces with heat pumps. But the story behind that is, in fact, the story of a young mother talking about now not having an oil furnace but a heat pump, and talking about the impact of better air quality, and then saying that her 3 children who used to use asthma puffers don't need them anymore because the air quality is better. To me, that's the way you de-intellectualize conversations about SDGs. You have to make it real. You have to make it relevant. We all know someone who probably uses a puffer. And when you say, my friend or my family member may not need to use a puffer, if we're having better homes in terms of energy quality and we're using technologies like heat pumps so that we have better indoor air, or we have better indoor air because we're using more high efficiency wood stoves, so reducing PM 2.5, which causes cancer in people. That's the way we de-intellectualize it. You make it real, you make it something that people touch, and you can make it has to be something that people say, you know what, that actually is about me or my family or the friends of my circle.
It's funny because when we advance on adaptation to climate change in our project, very often we're going to contact ministries, municipalities, watershed organizations, etc., or even ski centers, etc. And we will ask them, who's responsible for adaptation to climate change? And most ministries are gonna say, oh, it's the Ministry of Environment. They will lead you to specific area. But then when you change the words and you say, so who's interested about the impacts of weather on water resources, on growth of trees, or you use plain words, and then suddenly they say, oh, I'm in charge of that. So I mean, it's really key to put yourself in the shoes of the people you're talking with in order to create those connections and to facilitate those connections and to get the discussion going to do much further afterwards.
Jazz, I wonder if I could pose a question as we're wrapping up here to both Janhabi and then another one to you. Janhabi, I mean, one of the things the government of Canada has done, and I think kudos are really deserving, particularly in terms of the action on climate, for the climate levy, for various mechanisms of both regulatory and policy and programs. I wonder, Janhabi, if you could share, what are you really excited about as Environment and Climate Change Canada is looking at the next change, the next wave of climate action that addresses clean energy and other social needs? And Jazz, I wonder if we could almost end the session with a word to you to speak from the heart as to what change you would like our society to take on for people.
There's a couple things, more about how we're doing things and what we're climate change, climate action, climate adaptation isn't about the Department of Environment and Climate Change, even if it's on our name, right? It transcends all of the government. And that's not an easy thing for big bureaucracies and institutions to do, to kind of turn on their head the way they've been organized and the way they've taught to kind of think in these certain, linear ways, and to try to now go out and across and collaborate in ways not only with civil society and academics and private industry, but even within ourselves. And so, it may not be very sympathetic, the work of bureaucrats, but I see some real energy in being able to, both within the government, understand that all these things are connected and exactly framing problems as you have, Elaine, as transcending these kind of traditional roles. And also really seeing this internalization of the need to understand the disproportionate impacts, particularly of the current impacts of climate change by certain communities and individuals, and ensuring they're included. I think acknowledging that some of the communities that we think of as vulnerable are actually the ones that have been the most resilient over time and geography, and that they can teach us on what we need to do better and how we need to think differently. And so I think that kind of, changing the way we do business is essential and inspiring, because it gives me confidence that we are going to be able to tackle kind of this next level of problem solving. I think the other thing that I am excited about is seeing that even in the course of just the last 1 or 2 years, important, significant economic actors, whether they be financial or industrial, are really starting to understand the business needs for changing the way they do business, and government really, trying to work in collaboration to both kind of require change as well as incent change. So this kind of carrot and stick approach, which is certainly kind of the way we've tried to make these changes before, but combined with the vast potential of technological change, I'm excited to see where kind of the investment of kind of significant economic and industrial actors in collaboration with government could really kind of lead to those real, important leapfrog kind of steps in technology that we need to see in order to be able to transform at scale.
Great connections there. Would anybody else like to add on before I answer my portion of Chris's question? Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, Chris, thank you so much for asking about youth and in these spaces. I think that's so important, and I think that these are questions that folks in positions of power should ask more often. Ask youth that you're intersecting with or you're sharing a space with, like, what do you need? What do you need from us? I think overall, it's being able to not only voice our thoughts, voice our perspectives, but also be part of decision making. So ensuring that we're not only heard, but our opinions and our thoughts are reflected in policy change. That where, we kind of go beyond having a seat at the table if you want to say. Some other thoughts that also kind of came across my mind are really investing in the young people of today. And that can look like many things. I would ask folks to assess what are some resources that you have that you can offer up to youth. Is that monetary? Is it mentorship? Is it bringing folks to these large spaces or just into the room? What does that look like for you? What I love about youth in the climate movement is that there are so many areas for us to get involved, from taking our first steps in this space and just learning about it to actually being in our power and making decisions. Those are values that we really try to shape at Youth Climate Lab, for example. We really like to focus on climate action in the sense of skill building for young people, climate finance, as well as policy. And those are kind of our cores and our shifts that we focus on when we engage with young people in this space. But actually, we've had a couple more questions that have come up in our chat as well, which I'll just kind of read out here. See.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the questions, yes, if I might, what I think the three questions that have just been asked is talking about how does transformation occur? And it's a great question. And I think, you know, both Elaine and Abby have reflected that, and as have you in your just most recent response. And so this is difficult. I mean, our natural inclination as human beings is to look at status quo. Our natural inclination as societies and economies is to be focused on inertia. And so basically we're challenging ourselves. The publication shortly out is about mind shift, mindfulness, and mindset. Is that you have to say, okay, well, we've all changed at times. We change the way we're going to exercise better, we're changing going to eat better, or we're going to be better about our relationships. That's what we're trying to figure out here. And I very much agree with the point that Jen Habby says that we have to, it is business as usual. And it's not business as usual, but it's not just business. It's about transformation, which is what Elaine got to get at too. So it's about that transformational process. Hey, there's a great line from a comedian called Red Green. He used to say, I'm a man, I can change. If I have to, I guess. To me, that's the classic term about the challenges of change and transformation. But I guess we have to change, so let's change.
If I can add to that point, it's a bit unfortunate, but let's say in Quebec, for example, there was some major floodings in 2017 that kind of shocked a lot of the communities and the municipalities and the governments, etc. And, usually, it would be an initial shock, and then everything would go back as normal afterward. And then another one happened in 2019, 2 times in a row. Now people started to say, wow, I mean, this is getting serious. We really have to do something. Now, the challenge here is that, so there's an expression that says never waste a good crisis. So, of course, we unfortunately need to capitalize on those events to make everyone realize that there is an urgency here, because there is an issue with the fact that people are not really necessarily understanding that it's an urgent issue. But then gradually we need to move in a shift of prevention, of acting before those type of events happen. So this is obviously going to be an ongoing challenge for the future, to make everyone realize that there's not only short term in life, there's also medium and long term to consider.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Genevieve, anything to add? We have one more question that's also come through, which I can open up to the panel as well. Perfect.
I'm going to, put out maybe an approach that will work for some people and not others. But, as I see in some of the questions about, how do we do something to contribute to the SDGs, or how do we ensure that we can transform business or energy systems effectively. I do think one of the challenges, after we've spent, an hour talking about how transformational things need to be, is to get overwhelmed by that and not to be able to actually effectively engage professionally or personally, because it's everything, right? And how do you do that all the time? I have a feeling Chris's upcoming book might be able to actually explain some of that to me, but until I get a chance to read it, what I would suggest is that, there's a distinction between kind of working within a set of principles and frameworks, and the SDGs can be an example of that, or kind of your personal views on the things that you want to take on, or you want to take on for your enterprise or institution, and then kind of focusing your action over a given kind of issue or a period of time and being able to take that on. So, do I expect that every small and medium enterprise that's been, impacted by the pandemic is now going to return with a full comprehensive understanding of how to measure risk for, climate, adverse events, and how to mitigate their emissions, and, also how to ensure that they're serving, marginalized communities? Like, that's a lot to take on if you're, a small business owner in a community. So what are the principles that are driving your action? And what are the things then that you want to focus on? And hopefully then what governments can do and civil society organizations is to offer you kind of toolkits and pathways to be able to get there. And I do think those are under development, but I would suggest that as an approach to maybe making this kind of transformation more tangible.
Yeah, I actually wanted to build upon that a little bit as well, in terms of transformation. And again, kind of similar, this may be applicable to some, but not everyone. Speaking in the perspective of youth, and I guess this is more advice or a theory that I like to keep in my heart when I'm, present in this work, is reflect on your community. And, that can mean anything to you. Maybe that is your city, maybe that is your family, it can be larger. Maybe your community is what we call Canada. And I would say understand the needs of your community and how you can fill those. I think for young people, especially that are entering the space, I see often not understanding what the needs are and applying projects, for example, or toolkits that may not work and not seeing the results that maybe you were thinking of. So I think for me, working in this space, the first step is know your people, know what their actual needs are, because they may look very different from what is actually perceived. Thank you so much, folks. We're approaching the end, but there's one more question that I would like to ask before we wrap up, which comes from the audience. So speaking in the context of Sustainable Development Goal 17, partnerships of the goals, their question is, how is Canada contributing to its targets, and what are the barriers to record significant progress, mostly regarding the engagement in vulnerable regions and sectors of our country?
Yes, there's a great story there in terms of Indigenous clean energy. I mean, of the over 200 major clean energy projects and over 3,000 smaller projects, virtually all of them through partnerships. So I think talking about it nationally, you have to locate it in domains and sectors. We're pleased to share the story of our sector, and anyone can go to our website, indigenouscleanenergy.com, and see the actual metrics and stories that we tell in that sector. But what I would emphasize is a new word that hasn't been raised yet in our panel. And that is the issue which you've hinted at in your comment about people. To me, it's about relationship. Partnership is the product of relationship. And so it's incredible to me to see those hundreds of medium to large renewable projects and thousands of smaller projects with Indigenous project leadership. It involved relationship between them and project developers and technology companies, utilities, and government partners and technology partners. That was based on relationship. When you have relationship, trust is created. And the foundation of trust allows us to change and transform. And building that relationship changes us individually. I mean, we all know that great relationships make us better at who we are, and actually, it actually fuels our soul. So to my mind is that, yes, let's track relationships for SDG 17. We're pleased to share how relationships and partnerships has worked in the Indigenous clean energy sector, but focus on relationship. We will not address the issue of climate action and the challenges of the existential threat of climate change without new relationships, but new relationships help us to transform.
If I may add to this, and come back to what Janabi has said before, very short sentence, but very important. It's not that much on the what we are doing, but in the how we are doing. And this is where partnerships becomes key to generate, both to generate changes, but also to generate changes that are not going to be leaving other people out of the discussion. Because as soon as there are changes happening in our society, there is always a huge risk during those changes that you're going to left even more people out of the system in the future. So, and I really think that the how is going to be key. So obviously we want to be as inclusive as possible, to connect with people that have not been involved that much into the mess in which we're in right now. And the how is going to make a huge difference to move forward in a positive way.
Perfect. Thank you so much, folks. I'm going to pause for a moment to see if any of our panelists have anything else to add before giving my thanks and wrapping up.
I have one final thing, Yaz, and that is, Jazz, that relates to the fact that we are all on Indigenous territory and ancestral land. Mm-hmm. And I think as we deal with climate action, as we deal with a sustainable development future using the SDGs as a tool, let us all embrace, and I know Chirke would certainly see this in his work with future ancestors, is really let's us all embrace the fact that that is both the truth, but that is also the basis of the future. And recognizing ancestral land and recognizing the role of Indigenous communities that have to play on clean energy and climate action will be the truth that we have to express into reality.
Yes, thank you so much. That is wonderful. I'm going to pause for a second too for Elaine and Janabi, if you folks would like to add any closing remarks.
I just wanted to make a shout out with a caveat. So there are a couple consultations coming up from the federal government side. One is on the National Adaptation Strategy, and one is on fact the government's strategy on the Federal Sustainable Development Goals Strategy. These kinds of consultations, these online opportunities to send your comments or to join small groups may not feel like developing relationships. And I do think that that is absolutely the heart of partnerships. And that's some of the challenges when the federal government, for instance, or other levels of government do business. It doesn't feel like relationship building. But I wanted to take a moment to just say, as one of those nameless, faceless bureaucrats, it matters. And everyone reads those comments, they get shared, and every opportunity we have to hear from people, no matter how kind of distant or personal it seems, matters to the individuals who take in that feedback, and it informs the way that they go about their business. And so I really want to encourage everyone, but particularly the youth in the audience, to, don't be deterred by the ways that we engage. If you have the energy, lean in and embrace it, and you might be kind of surprised by the impact that it has on these, big institutions.
So maybe just a quick word from me, and I almost forget to say it, and I should not have forgotten. I'm actually supported by Environment and Climate Change Canada to do the Adaptation Futures 2023 conference. So that's an international conference on adaptation to climate change. And it's actually going to be a part virtual and part in location in Montreal. And, of course, the idea is to try to contribute to reduce greenhouse gases instead of having people all over the world to move in Montreal to exchange on adaptation. But it's going to be a great opportunity to showcase what Canada is doing and advancing on adaptation to climate change, and also how we do it. So I invite people to get informed on that conference. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Elaine, Janabi, and Chris, what a special space this was to share with you. Your your ideas and your thoughts and your answers to the questions and conversations we've had today have really resonated with me, and I'm sure that is true for everyone in the audience as well. From here, I will actually pass it back to Shuk to wrap up and move forward to the next piece of our Together conference today. Thank you so much for
Merhaba Niji, Jasveen, merci beaucoup Chris, Alain et Janavi.
Thank you very much, Chris, Alain, Janavi. It was a pleasure to listen to you.
I want to sort of maybe do a little overview of some of the things I learned from you guys, right? I heard Janavi say it is debilitating to have shifted your mindset, but not have the tools to enact your new way of being. And I think that's incredibly powerful and incredibly valid, right? As we're here, educating ourselves, as we're growing, as we're learning, we're still in some systems that don't sort of enable us to enact the learning that we've done. And that can be debilitating. And that can be discouraging, and we have to acknowledge that. Alain a dit, on a besoin de montrer preuve de patience, pas avec le temps, mais avec
Alain
les
said
gens.
that we have to be patient,
une partie très, très importante à
not
reconnaître
because of
également.
time, but
Le fait
because
que,
of people.
oui, on a besoin de se dépêcher, on a besoin de réaliser tous ces
It's true
objectifs-là.
that we need to,
Donc,
in
on
a
n'a pas
way,
besoin de se montrer
rush
preuve de patience quand
to
c'est par rapport au
achieve
temps.
the
Mais on a besoin
SDGs.
de quand même
We do not
trouver une
need
manière de se montrer
patience
patient quand c'est par
because of
rapport
time, but we have
aux
to
gens,
show
quand c'est par rapport
patience
à nos
with
voisins. Et ça, c'est
people
quelque chose qui est très important.
and to our
And
neighbors.
Chris
That's
highlighted
important.
time and time again that there's power in storytelling. So tell your story, share your story, right? And this goes back to what we heard Huitum say in the beginning, that we all have treasure chests. And, you know, we all need to be able to share and listen. And so, you know, without shame, sans gêne, share your story. And Jasveen said, ask youth what they need. What do you want? What do you need from us? How can we support you? And think to yourself what resources you're able to offer. If you're not rich, fine. Doesn't have to be money, but can it be opportunities? Can it be time? Can it be wisdom? Can it be connections? And I'm going to sort of end this wrap up with saying my challenge for all of you listening right now is that if a piece of advice that was given during that panel does not seem immediately applicable to you, because there are moments where Jen Habi and moments where Jasveen said, you know, this may not be applicable to everybody. They were wrong. It is applicable to you, right? If you hear something about good health and you say to yourself, oh, well, that's not the space I work in, so that doesn't apply to me. It does. Find ways of taking the advice, the knowledge, the gold, the treasure that you have just been given, and apply it to your work, apply it to your life, apply it to your communities. Find ways of taking what was said. And if it's not immediately applicable to you, when you hear someone talking about power heaters and air pumps and air quality, and you're thinking to yourself, well, I live in a city, I live in a small town that has great air quality, fantastic. But think about the message behind that example, that advice that was given, and transfer it to what you do.